On the morning of June 4, 1942, Ensign George Gay floated alone in the Pacific Ocean, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, hiding beneath a black rubber seat cushion so Japanese fighters would not strafe him in the water. Around him, scattered across miles of empty sea, were the burning fragments of 15 torpedo bombers. The bodies of 29 men drifted somewhere nearby, men he had trained with, flown with, joked with just hours earlier. Every single aircraft from his squadron had been shot down. Every single pilot and gunner was dead, except him. George Gay was 25 years old. He had a bullet wound in his left arm and shrapnel embedded in his hand. His rear gunner had been killed in the air. His plane had crashed into the ocean at nearly 200 miles per hour, and now, treading water 4 miles from the Japanese fleet, he was about to witness something no other American would see with their own eyes. He watched the Japanese carriers burn. He watched the dive bombers arrive. He watched the explosions tear open the flight decks. He watched the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled begin to die, ship by ship, in walls of flame and smoke. And he understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His squadron's suicidal attack had not been meaningless. It had not been a waste. Their deaths, all 29 of them, had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level at exactly the right moment. They had cleared the sky. They had opened the door. The dive bombers that destroyed the Japanese fleet arrived because Torpedo Squadron 8 had already died. This is the story of the most devastating sacrifice in American naval aviation history. It is the story of 15 obsolete aircraft, 30 brave men, and 6 minutes that changed the Pacific War. And it is the story of the one man who survived to see what their deaths had purchased. The spring of 1942 was the darkest period of the Pacific War for the United States. Pearl Harbor had been a catastrophe. The Pacific Fleet's battleships lay twisted and burned in the shallow harbor. Wake Island had fallen. Guam had fallen. The Philippines were collapsing day by day. American and Filipino defenders pushed back toward Corregidor in a desperate last stand. Singapore, the great British fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, had surrendered in February with over 80,000 troops, the worst defeat in British military history. The Dutch East Indies had fallen in March. Burma was falling. Australia feared invasion. Japan seemed unstoppable. The Imperial Japanese Navy dominated the Pacific with a carrier force that had never been defeated. 6 fleet carriers had launched the Pearl Harbor attack: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Those same carriers had since raided Darwin, Australia, killing over 200 people and sinking dozens of ships. They had swept through the Indian Ocean in April, sinking the British carrier Hermes and the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire with contemptuous ease. Japanese naval aviators were the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, veterans of years of combat operations over China and across the Pacific. American carriers had survived Pearl Harbor only because they had been at sea that Sunday morning. But survival was not victory. The USS Lexington had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, the first fleet carrier lost by either side. The USS Yorktown had been badly damaged in the same battle, struck by bombs that started fires and killed dozens of her crew. She limped back to Pearl Harbor trailing oil, needing months of repair that she did not have. The Pacific Fleet had only 3 carriers left operational: Enterprise, Hornet, and the wounded Yorktown. Against them, Japan was preparing to send 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and an invasion force aimed at Midway Atoll. The operation would involve nearly 200 ships and over 100,000 men. It was the largest naval operation Japan had ever undertaken. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them. The capture of Midway would force the Americans to respond. When they did, the combined fleet would be waiting. Once the American carrier force was annihilated, nothing would stand between Japan and total control of the Pacific. Hawaii would be vulnerable. The American West Coast would be threatened. The war could be ended on Japanese terms within a year. American codebreakers changed everything. Station Hypo, the Navy's crypt-analysis unit at Pearl Harbor, had been working for months to break the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. Commander Joseph Rochefort, who ran the unit, was an eccentric genius who worked 20-hour days in a basement surrounded by stacks of intercepts, wearing a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers. His team of cryptanalysts and linguists pieced together fragments of intercepted messages, slowly building a picture of Japanese intentions. By late May, they had determined that the Japanese were planning a major operation against a target they called ___, quote, _0, ___. The messages mentioned carriers, invasion forces, and a timetable. But what was AF? Rochefort believed AF was Midway. The location made strategic sense. The timing fit the operational requirements, but he needed proof. He arranged for Midway to send a fake message in plain language reporting problems with their water distillation plant. The message went out over an insecure channel that Japanese intelligence was known to monitor. Days later, Japanese radio traffic mentioned that AF was having water problems. The trap was confirmed, but now the Americans would be the ones setting it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, made a decision that would determine the fate of the war. He would send his 3 carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet northeast of Midway. Enterprise and Hornet would sail under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Yorktown, despite needing 90 days of repair, would sail after just 48 hours in dry dock. Patched together by 1,400 workers who labored around the clock. The Japanese would not know the Americans were waiting. They would not know their codes had been broken. They would sail into battle expecting to find only the small garrison on Midway, and perhaps 1 American carrier at most. Instead, they would find the entire American carrier force waiting for them. But Nimitz knew the odds. 4 Japanese carriers against 3 American carriers. Japanese pilots with years of combat experience against American pilots who had barely seen action. Japanese aircraft that were faster, more maneuverable, and, in the case of the Zero fighter, legendary for their combat performance. Everything depended on striking first, everything depended on surprise, and everything depended on the torpedo bombers getting close enough to matter. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been commissioned in September 1941. Just 3 months before Pearl Harbor, their commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, a 41-year-old career naval aviator from Fort Pierre, South Dakota. Waldron was part Oglala Sioux on his mother's side. He was intense, driven, physically tough, and absolutely convinced that his squadron would see heavy combat. While other officers downplayed the threat of war with Japan, Waldron trained his men relentlessly. He pushed them harder than any squadron in the fleet. He was also deeply frustrated. Torpedo Squadron 8 flew the Douglas TBD Devastator, a torpedo bomber that had been revolutionary when it entered service in 1937. It was the first all-metal monoplane torpedo bomber in the Navy. It had an enclosed cockpit, hydraulically folding wings, and what was considered advanced armament for its time. By 1942, it was obsolete. 5 years of rapid aviation development had transformed aerial warfare. The Devastator was slow. Its maximum speed barely exceeded 200 miles per hour, and at combat weight, carrying a torpedo, it could manage perhaps 115 miles per hour on the attack run. It was poorly armed, with only 1 forward-firing machine gun and 1 gun for the rear gunner. Its torpedo attack profile was essentially suicidal. Pilots had to fly low and slow, no higher than 80 feet above the water, in a straight line toward the target, holding course for an agonizing 30 to 40 seconds, while anti-aircraft guns and fighters tore into them. Against modern Japanese fighters, the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, the Devastator was a death trap. The Zero could make 330 miles per hour in level flight. It was fantastically maneuverable, able to outturn any fighter the Americans possessed. It could climb to 20,000 feet in just over 7 minutes. Its twin 20mm cannons and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns could tear a Devastator apart with a single firing pass. Japanese pilots called the Zero the Hand of God for its incredible agility. Allied pilots who encountered it in combat rarely survived to describe what they had faced. And the Japanese pilots flying them were not ordinary aviators. They were the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy, men who had been selected through brutal competition, trained for years in peacetime, and tested in combat over China. Many had more than 2,000 hours of flight time. Some had been flying combat missions since 1937. By every measure that mattered, they were the best carrier pilots in the world. The American pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8 were good, but they were not in the same category. Most had fewer than 300 hours of flight time. Most had never seen combat. They were young, eager, well-trained, and flying aircraft that gave them almost no chance of surviving against what they would face. Waldron knew this. His men knew this. Everyone in the Navy knew this. But there was nothing else available. And there was another problem that the pilots of VT-8 discussed among themselves, quietly, when senior officers were not around. The Mark 13 torpedo, the weapon their entire mission depended upon, was notoriously unreliable. The Mark 13 had been designed in the 1930s and had never been adequately tested in combat conditions. It ran deep, sometimes deeper than its setting indicated, which meant it might pass harmlessly beneath a target's hull. Its magnetic exploder was temperamental, sometimes detonating prematurely, sometimes not detonating at all. The torpedo required a drop from no higher than 80 feet at no more than 150 knots, which meant the aircraft had to fly low and slow for what felt like an eternity while under fire. In fleet exercises, the Mark 13 had performed poorly. Maintenance crews struggled with its complex mechanisms. Pilots had little confidence in it. But criticizing Navy ordnance was not encouraged, and so the Mark 13 remained the standard aerial torpedo in service. On the morning of June 4th, every pilot in Torpedo Squadron 8 would fly toward the Japanese fleet carrying a weapon that might or might not work in an aircraft that could not evade enemy fighters. Hoping that their sacrifice would accomplish something, anything, that would justify the price they were about to pay, the Navy had developed a replacement, the Grumman TBF Avenger. It was faster, better armed, more survivable, but only a handful had reached the fleet. 6 brand new Avengers were assigned to Torpedo Squadron 8, but they were detached to Midway Island itself, under a different commander, Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling. Waldron's 15 Devastators would launch from the carrier Hornet. In the weeks before Midway, Waldron drove his pilots hard. He insisted on low-level formation flying until they could hold position in the tightest conditions, wingtip to wingtip, barely 50 feet above the waves. He demanded precision navigation, teaching them to find targets by dead reckoning and instinct when instruments failed. He made them practice torpedo runs until they could execute them in their sleep. The steady approach, the precise angle, the release at exactly the right moment. He also spent hours studying the charts of the Pacific Northwest of Midway, memorizing currents, wind patterns, and the positions where he believed the Japanese carriers would be. The other pilots in the squadron developed a grudging respect for Waldron's intensity, even when it drove them to exhaustion. He was not an easy man to serve under. He expected perfection and accepted nothing less. He pushed them past what they thought they could endure. But he also protected them from interference by other officers, fought for better equipment and maintenance, and never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. In the ready room discussions that pilots inevitably had when senior officers were not listening, the men of VT-8 talked about what they would face. They knew the Devastator's limitations. They knew the Zero's capabilities. They knew that a torpedo attack against a defended carrier force without fighter escort was likely suicide. But they also knew what they had signed up for. In the months after Pearl Harbor, every man in the Navy understood that hard times were coming. The Japanese had proved they were formidable. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody. Someone would have to fly the difficult missions. Someone would have to take the risks that might not pay off. Torpedo Squadron 8 was that someone. His pilots were young. Most were in their early 20s, recent graduates of naval flight training. They came from across America, from Texas and California, from New York and Ohio, from small towns and growing cities. They had joined the Navy for different reasons: adventure, patriotism, the dream of flight, escape from limited prospects at home. Now they found themselves preparing for what might be the most important naval battle of the war. Ensign George Henry Gay was 25, from Waco, Texas, with a quick grin and an easy manner that made him popular throughout the squadron. Gay had learned to fly at 16, barnstorming across Texas in borrowed aircraft, teaching himself aerobatics by trial and error. He had joined the Navy in 1940 and earned his wings just months before Pearl Harbor. He was assigned as one of the squadron's junior pilots and navigation officers, which meant he spent long hours with Waldron, studying charts and calculating courses. Gay was not the most skilled pilot in the squadron, but he was among the most enthusiastic. He loved to fly. He loved the camaraderie of squadron life, the jokes, the competitions, the shared meals and shared fears. He wrote long letters home to his family in Texas, describing life on the carrier, the endless ocean, the anticipation of combat that all of them felt. He liked Waldron. He respected his intensity and his conviction that they would strike important blows against the Japanese. He appreciated that Waldron treated his pilots as men, not children, and told them the truth about what they faced. But he also understood what everyone understood. If they went into battle with the Devastators against Japanese carriers defended by Zeros, many of them would not come back. Perhaps none of them would. It was a calculation that every pilot made in the privacy of his own thoughts, weighing his chances, wondering whether his name would be on the casualty lists that would follow the battle. George Gay decided he would not think about it. He would fly his mission, do his job, and let fate decide the rest. It was the only way to function when the mathematics of survival pointed toward zero. On June 3, 1942, the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown took position approximately 200 miles northeast of Midway, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance. The pilots knew the battle was coming. Tension filled the ready rooms and the wardrooms. Men wrote letters home, some cheerful, some somber, most somewhere in between. Some played cards, some prayed, some slept poorly or not at all, lying in their bunks and staring at the steel overhead, thinking about what the morning would bring. The ships were at general quarters from before dawn. The pre-battle routine was exhausting, checking aircraft, arming weapons, briefing and rebriefing on expected enemy positions and attack procedures. The food in the mess was the same as always, but it tasted different. Everything tasted different when you might not eat another meal. That evening, Lieutenant Commander Waldron gathered Torpedo Squadron 8 for a final briefing in the ready room aboard Hornet. The room was dark except for the light illuminating the charts and photographs spread across the briefing board. 30 men sat in the tiered seats, pilots in front, radio man gunners behind them. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Waldron stood at the front and spoke plainly. There was no false optimism in his voice, no empty cheerleading. He told them what they already knew. Their aircraft were slow. Their torpedo attack would require a long, straight approach at low altitude, 50 to 80 feet above the water, slow enough that a man could outrun them on foot. They would be vulnerable to fighters from the moment they were detected until the moment they released their torpedoes, and even after, as they tried to escape. The Zeros they would face were faster, more maneuverable, and more numerous than anything they could put against them. He paused and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his pilots. Many of them would be killed, he said. Perhaps all of them. That was the truth of the situation, and he would not insult them by pretending otherwise. Then he told them what he believed. He believed in the squadron. He believed in their training. He believed in their ability to find the enemy and press home an attack regardless of opposition. And he had a prediction about the enemy's location. He believed the Japanese carriers would be found to the southwest of where the official navigation staff expected them, closer to Midway, not farther away. The Japanese commander would turn toward the island to recover his aircraft after the morning strike. Waldron was certain of it. The official heading would take them the wrong way, he said. He intended to trust his own judgment. No one in the room objected. By now, they trusted Waldron more than they trusted staff officers who had never faced what they were about to face. That night, after the briefing had ended and the pilots had dispersed to their bunks, Waldron sat alone in the ready room and wrote a message to his men. It was not an order. It was not a tactical instruction. It was something else entirely, a final word from a commander who understood that he was sending his men into something from which most of them would not return. __quote_2__. He signed it with his name, John C. Waldron, and posted it on the ready room blackboard, where every man would see it in the morning. George Gay read the message when he came into the ready room before dawn. He stood in front of it for a long moment, letting the words sink in. The message was not really about tactics. It was not really about getting hits on Japanese carriers. It was about something deeper, about duty, about sacrifice, about the willingness to die for something larger than yourself. Waldron was telling them, as clearly as language permitted, that survival was secondary to mission accomplishment. Their job was to attack the Japanese carriers and put torpedoes in the water. If that meant flying into certain death, they would fly into certain death. That was what they had trained for. That was what the Navy expected of them. That was what the war required. Gay read the message twice, then went to check his aircraft. He noticed that his hands were steady. He noticed that his breathing was calm. Somewhere in the night, he had made peace with what was coming. He would fly his mission. He would do his job. Whatever happened after that was beyond his control. Gay went to bed that night, not knowing if he would see June 5th, but he slept deeply, the sleep of exhaustion and resignation. When the call to general quarters came before dawn, he was ready. Dawn on June 4th came with scattered clouds at 1,500 feet, a moderate sea, and a light breeze from the southeast. At 4:30 in the morning, the Japanese began launching their strike on Midway Island. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters rose from the four carriers and formed up for the 240-mile flight to the atoll. At 6:30, the Japanese aircraft struck Midway. They bombed the airfield, the fuel storage facilities, and the defensive positions. American fighters from Midway, mostly obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and a handful of newer F-4F Wildcats, rose to intercept them. It was a slaughter. 15 of the 26 American fighters were shot down in minutes. The Japanese lost only 6 aircraft. The strike was successful, but the attack commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, reported a critical assessment. A second strike would be needed to neutralize the island's defenses completely before invasion forces could land. This decision would prove catastrophic. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force from his flagship Akagi, faced a dilemma. His aircraft had returned from the first Midway strike and needed to be rearmed and refueled. Some of his planes had been held back throughout the morning, armed with torpedoes in case American ships appeared. But no American ships had been detected. His reconnaissance flights had found nothing. Nagumo ordered the aircraft and standby to be rearmed with bombs for a second strike on Midway. His crews went to work in the hangar decks below. The heavy torpedoes were removed from the aircraft and set aside. Bombs were brought up from the magazines. The process was time-consuming and difficult. Ordnance carts rolled across the hangars. Fuel lines were connected and disconnected. Armed aircraft waited in various stages of preparation. Then, at 7:28, One of Nagumo's scout planes, a Nakajima float plane from the cruiser Tone that had launched late due to mechanical problems, sent an electrifying message. It had sighted American ships. The message was fragmentary and unclear. Nagumo demanded clarification. What ships? How many? What type? Minutes ticked by, while the scout pilot struggled to identify what he was seeing through broken clouds. Was it cruisers, destroyers, supply ships? Finally, at 8:20, the scout confirmed the worst possible news. The American force included what appeared to be an aircraft carrier. Everything changed. Nagumo now faced a terrible choice. His first strike was returning from Midway, low on fuel and ammunition, and needed to land immediately. His standby aircraft were half rearmed with bombs when they should have torpedoes for an anti-ship strike, and somewhere to the north, an American carrier was launching aircraft that might already be heading toward his fleet. He ordered his planes rearmed again, this time with torpedoes for attacking ships. The hangar decks became scenes of controlled chaos. Ordnance crews who had just loaded bombs now removed them and began wrestling torpedoes back into position. The process would take at least an hour. In the meantime, the returning Midway strike needed to land. Flight deck operations had to be coordinated. Everything had to happen at once. The Japanese carriers were loaded with fuel, ammunition, and aircraft in various stages of preparation. Bombs sat on ordnance carts, awaiting removal to the magazines. Fuel lines snaked across the hangars. Aviation gasoline vapors filled the air. The carriers were vulnerable, but the Americans had to find them first, and aboard Hornet, the order came to launch. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Torpedo Squadron 8 began taking off from Hornet's deck. 15 Devastators, 30 men, each aircraft carrying a single Mark 13 torpedo, weighing 2,000 pounds. The plan called for a coordinated strike: torpedo bombers from all three carriers, dive bombers from all three carriers, fighters as escort. Together they would overwhelm the Japanese defenses, but coordination failed almost immediately. The air groups launched at different times. They were given different headings based on different estimates of where the Japanese fleet would be. The dive bombers climbed to high altitude, 14,000 feet or more, while the torpedo bombers stayed low to conserve fuel, skimming just 50 feet above the waves. Hornet's air group became separated in the first few minutes after launch. The dive bombers climbed and headed southwest. The fighter squadron, VF-8 with 10 Wildcat fighters, climbed with them. The torpedo bombers stayed low, and then, somehow, in the confusion of the launch, the squadrons lost each other. Commander Stanhope Ring, leading the Hornet Air Group, took the dive bombers and fighters on a heading that would prove completely wrong. They flew past the Japanese fleet entirely and never found it. Some would run out of fuel and ditch in the ocean. Others would struggle back to Hornet or divert to Midway. They contributed nothing to the battle. John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8, faced a choice. He could follow Ring on the official heading, the heading that his superiors had ordered, the heading that navigation staff insisted was correct, or he could trust his instincts. Waldron believed what he had predicted the night before. The Japanese fleet would be closer to Midway than the official plot indicated. As the dive bombers disappeared to the northwest, he made his decision. He turned south. George Gay was flying the last aircraft on the left side of the squadron formation. From his cockpit, barely 50 feet above the waves, he watched the formation turn away from the heading the other squadrons were flying. He understood immediately what was happening. Waldron was taking them on his own course, trusting his judgment over the official plot. They were alone. No fighters above them, no dive bombers in support. 15 slow torpedo bombers flying toward 4 Japanese carriers, defended by dozens of Zero fighters and surrounded by the anti-aircraft guns of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. They were carrying unreliable torpedoes and obsolete aircraft against the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. Every man in the formation understood the mathematics. They had calculated the odds in the ready room discussions, in the quiet conversations in the bunks at night, in the private assessments that pilots made when they were honest with themselves. The numbers did not add up to survival. The flight took over an hour. The Devastators droned southwest at low altitude, engines laboring against the humid tropical air, burning fuel they could not afford to waste. Gay scanned the horizon constantly, looking for any sign of the enemy fleet, looking for the smoke or the wakes that would tell them they had found their targets. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, blue and empty under the morning sun. The sound of the engine was hypnotic. The vibration of the aircraft was constant. Gay checked his instruments, adjusted his heading to stay in formation, and tried not to think about what was waiting for them. He thought instead about the details of the attack, the approach altitude, the release point, the escape route after the torpedo was away. He thought about Huntington in the rear cockpit, manning the single machine gun that was their only defense against fighters. He did not think about dying. There was no point in thinking about dying. It would happen, or it would not. At 9:18, just past 2 hours after launch, they found the Japanese fleet. It appeared on the horizon like a city rising from the sea, massive fleet carriers with their long, flat decks, towering battleships bristling with guns, lean cruisers cutting white wakes through the dark water, destroyers screening the perimeter in a protective ring. The formation stretched across miles of ocean, the most powerful concentration of naval power Japan had ever assembled. Waldron had been right. The Japanese were exactly where he had predicted, to the southwest, closer to Midway than the official plot had indicated. His instinct, his hours of studying the charts, his understanding of how Japanese commanders thought, all of it had been correct. The squadron turned toward the nearest carrier. It was Soryu, 34,000 tons of steel and aviation fuel, her flight deck crawling with aircraft. Waldron knew they had been spotted. Japanese lookouts would have identified the approaching aircraft. Radio warnings would be going out across the fleet. Zeros would be scrambling from combat air patrol stations or redirecting from other tasks. Anti-aircraft guns would be training on the low-flying bombers. There was no time for clever tactics. There was no possibility of maneuvering for advantage. They were slow, they were visible, and the enemy knew they were coming. There was only the attack. Waldron gave the order over the radio, his voice calm and steady, despite what they all knew was about to happen. He pushed his throttle forward and led the squadron toward the carrier at full power, such as it was, perhaps 150 miles per hour, barely faster than an automobile on a highway. The formation spread slightly, giving each aircraft room to maneuver, but held together as it had been trained to do. The flak began almost immediately. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers, tracers reaching up from the cruisers. But the flak was not the real danger. The real danger came from above. Within seconds of the approach beginning, the first Zeros arrived. They came down from the combat air patrol, diving at incredible speed, their 20mm cannons blazing. The Devastators had no chance to evade. They were too slow, too low, too committed to the attack run. The Zeros could attack from any angle, from above, from below, from the sides, pouring fire into the fuel tanks, the engines, the cockpits. One by one, the Devastators began to burn. George Gay watched the planes ahead of him catch fire and spiral into the sea. He saw wingmen he had trained with explode in the air. He saw aircraft trailing smoke and flame continue toward the carrier until they crashed into the waves. At the front of the formation, Waldron's aircraft was hit. Flames erupted from the fuselage, but Waldron did not turn away. He kept flying toward Soryu, his burning plane clawing toward torpedo range, until the aircraft finally gave out and crashed into the ocean. The Zeros were everywhere now. Gay counted what seemed like dozens of them, swarming around the shrinking formation, making pass after pass. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers added to the carnage. Tracers filled the air. Black smoke from burning aircraft marked where squadron mates had died. 9 planes down. 10. 11. Gay's rear gunner, aviation radio man 3rd Class Robert Huntington, was firing back at the Zeros. He was 20 years old, from Buffalo, New York, operating the single .30 caliber machine gun in the rear cockpit. It was ridiculously inadequate against the Zeros, like throwing stones at eagles, but Huntington kept firing. Then, a burst of cannon fire ripped through the rear of the aircraft. Huntington's gun fell silent. Gay knew without looking that the young man was dead, 12 planes down, 13, 14. George Gay was the last one left. His aircraft had been hit multiple times. Control cables were damaged. Fuel was leaking. His hydraulic system was failing. A bullet had struck his left arm. Shrapnel had embedded itself in his hand. Zeros were still firing at him, but he was still flying, and he was still closing on Soryu. He could see the carrier now, the massive flight deck, the island superstructure, the aircraft spotted on deck. He lined up his torpedo run, following the procedures Waldron had drilled into them 100 times. Low and steady, straight toward the target. Hold course until the range is right. The anti-aircraft fire was intense. Tracers streaked past his cockpit. His aircraft shuddered from impacts. But he held his course, flying straight into the wall of fire, until the torpedo release indicator told him he was in range. He released his torpedo. The 2,000-pound weapon dropped from the aircraft and splashed into the water, its propeller spinning up, its gyroscope activating, sending it on a straight run toward Soryu's hull. Gay pulled up hard to clear the carrier's flight deck. He was so close he could see individual crewmen on deck, see the details of the aircraft parked there. Then the Zeros caught him. Cannon shells tore into his aircraft. His controls went dead. The Devastator rolled out of control, the horizon spinning crazily, and crashed into the ocean at nearly 200 miles per hour. The impact should have killed him. The Devastator hit the water at an angle, the nose digging in, the fuselage breaking apart, under the tremendous force of the crash. George Gay was thrown forward against his harness, then sideways as the aircraft tumbled. Water rushed in through the shattered canopy. Fuel and oil mixed with seawater around him. He was underwater, trapped in the wreckage, disoriented, drowning. Training took over. He found his harness release and pulled. He kicked against the seat, against the instrument panel, against anything solid enough to push against. He was tangled in cables, in debris, in the 1,000 small objects that had come loose in the crash. His lungs burned. His vision was going dark. He broke free. He kicked toward the light, toward the surface that seemed impossibly far above him. His life vest inflated automatically as he rose. His wounded arm screamed with pain at every stroke. Debris from the aircraft rose with him. Seat cushions, charts, personal effects, pieces of the aircraft itself. He broke the surface into chaos. The Japanese fleet surrounded him on every side. Destroyers were cutting through the water at high speed, their wakes creating waves that slapped against his face. Anti-aircraft guns were still firing at something, probably other American aircraft, approaching from a different direction. The roar of engines filled the air, both the deep rumble of ship power plants and the higher whine of aircraft circling overhead. A few hundred yards away, oil from his crashed Devastator was spreading across the surface in a dark slick. Debris floated everywhere, chunks of aluminum, soggy papers, life jackets that had deployed too late to save the men who had worn them. Of Torpedo Squadron 8, there was no one else visible. 29 men were dead. 15 aircraft were destroyed. George Gay, bleeding from his arm and hand, exhausted, barely able to stay afloat, was the sole survivor. And his torpedo, like every other torpedo launched by his squadron, had missed. He later learned that all of the torpedoes had missed, not just from his squadron, but from every torpedo bomber that attacked that morning. The Mark 13 torpedoes had performed exactly as their critics had predicted. They ran deep, they ran erratic, they failed to explode. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had not sunk any Japanese ships, but that was still hours in the future, at this moment, floating in the water surrounded by the enemy fleet. Gay had more immediate concerns. Japanese destroyers were passing close by. If they spotted him, they would either pick him up as a prisoner, which meant interrogation, likely torture, and imprisonment for the duration of the war, or they would strafe him in the water to save the trouble. He had heard stories about Japanese pilots strafing survivors. He had no way to know if the stories were true. He could not take the chance. He had his life vest and his rubber life raft. He could inflate the raft and climb in. Which would be more comfortable and more visible to American rescue aircraft later. But the bright yellow raft would be immediately obvious to any Japanese sailor or pilot who looked in his direction. He made a decision. He stayed in the water beside the deflated raft and pulled his seat cushion, a black rubber flotation device about 3 feet square, over his head and shoulders. The black rubber would blend with the dark water. He would be nearly invisible from a distance. He left just enough space beneath the cushion to breathe, and by tilting his head slightly, to watch what was happening around him. It was not comfortable. The water was cool, not cold enough to kill him quickly, but cold enough to drain his strength over time. His wounds continued to bleed, attracting small fish that bumped against his legs. Salt water stung every cut and scrape. The rubber cushion pressed against his face, smelling of oil and sweat and fear. But he was hidden, and so George Gay, 25 years old, wounded and alone, began to watch the most important naval battle of the Pacific War from a perspective no one else would ever have. For the next 30 minutes, little seemed to happen. The Japanese fleet continued its operations. Aircraft launched and recovered. Destroyers maintained their screening positions. The carriers turned into the wind and back again, maneuvering through some pattern that Gay did not understand. He could see the flat decks in the distance, the tiny figures of crewmen moving about, the occasional aircraft taking off for landing. Gay was cold. He was hurt. He was alone. The initial adrenaline of the crash and the escape was wearing off, replaced by exhaustion and a growing awareness of his situation. He was floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, miles from any rescue, surrounded by an enemy fleet that would kill or capture him if they found him. His wounds needed attention. His throat was dry. The salt water was irritating his eyes. He began to wonder if anyone else was coming. Had the American strike failed completely? Had every squadron been destroyed like his? Not quite. But the other torpedo squadrons had fared almost as badly. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise had attacked at almost the same time as Waldron's squadron, approaching from a different direction. 14 Devastators, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, had found the Japanese fleet and pressed their attack without hesitation. Like VT-8, they had no fighter escort. The Wildcat fighters that were supposed to protect them had become separated during the long flight from the carriers. Like VT-8, they ran the gauntlet of Zeros that descended on them from every angle. Lindsay himself was one of the first to die, his aircraft exploding in the air before he could release his torpedo. The squadron pressed on. 10 of the 14 aircraft were shot down in minutes, their crews killed or left to drown in the ocean. The 4 planes that survived limped back to Enterprise, riddled with bullet holes, 2 of them so badly damaged they would never fly again. No torpedo hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked minutes later. 12 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, with 6 Wildcat fighters as escort. The only torpedo squadron that morning with any fighter protection at all. But 6 fighters could not hold off the dozens of Zeros that swarmed the attacking aircraft. The Wildcats did their best, engaging the enemy fighters, drawing some of them away, but there were simply too many Zeros and too few Wildcats. 10 of the 12 torpedo bombers were shot down. Massey was killed, leading his squadron toward the carriers. 2 planes, just 2, managed to escape the slaughter and return to Yorktown. No torpedo hits. 41 torpedo bombers from 3 carriers had attacked the Japanese fleet that morning. 35 of those aircraft were destroyed. 82 men, pilots and rear seat gunners, were killed. Not a single torpedo struck a Japanese ship. It was the greatest single loss in the history of American naval aviation, a catastrophe, a slaughter, a complete failure by every conventional measure, and it changed the battle. This is what nobody realized in that terrible hour except, perhaps, a bleeding ensign floating under a seat cushion 4 miles from the Japanese fleet. The Zero fighters that had slaughtered the torpedo squadrons were now out of position. They were low, at sea level, where they had chased the Devastators. They were scattered across miles of ocean, having pursued individual targets in different directions. They were low on ammunition from making multiple firing passes against the slow-moving bombers. Some were low on fuel after the extended combat. Most critically, they could not climb quickly. A Zero that had descended to sea level to attack a torpedo bomber needed several minutes to climb back to the altitude where dive bombers would attack from. And in combat, several minutes might as well be several hours. The Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down by the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons. The sky above the carriers, the sky from which dive bombers would attack, was almost empty. And at that moment, with the last torpedo bombers crashing into the sea, with the Zeros chasing survivors at wave-top height, with the Japanese carriers preparing to launch their own counterstrike against the American fleet, the dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown finally arrived. George Gay heard them before he saw them, a sound unlike anything else in aviation, the high-pitched scream of aircraft diving at extreme angles, their engines roaring against the buffeting of disturbed air. He looked up from beneath his seat cushion and saw the sky fill with dark blue shapes, dozens of aircraft plummeting out of the scattered clouds at angles so steep they seemed to be falling rather than flying. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers of the United States Navy, the rugged, reliable aircraft that would be remembered as the ship killers at Midway. The Zeros that had massacred Torpedo Squadron 8 were at sea level, miles away, out of ammunition, out of position. They could not climb back up in time. They could not intercept the dive bombers. They could only watch as the attack they should have stopped fell upon the carriers they were sworn to defend. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had been circling for nearly an hour, leading the dive bombers of Enterprise's scouting squadron 6 and bombing Squadron 6, searching desperately for the Japanese fleet. His fuel gauges were dropping toward empty. Navigation errors had taken him far off course. The Japanese fleet was not where intelligence had predicted it would be. McCluskey had already passed his point of no return. If he did not find the enemy soon, his aircraft would run out of fuel and ditch in the ocean. He had been about to turn back when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer heading northeast at high speed, the Arashi, which had been depth-charging a submarine contact and was now racing to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey made a decision that would change history. He followed the destroyer's wake. The white foam trail stretched across the dark water like an arrow pointing toward the target. At 10:22, he found the Japanese carriers. The 4 carriers were turning into the wind, their long flight decks oriented to launch aircraft. Nagumo had finally sorted out the chaos of rearming his strike force and was preparing to send his bombers against the American carriers that his scouts had finally confirmed. The flight decks were packed with armed and fueled aircraft. Ordnance carts still sat in the hangars below, loaded with bombs and torpedoes that had been removed and not properly stowed. Aviation gasoline lines snaked across the decks. The hangar spaces below were filled with volatile fumes. The ships were bombs waiting for a spark. McCluskey pushed his control stick forward and dropped into his dive. 33 dive bombers from Enterprise split into 2 groups. One went for Kaga. One went for Akagi. They screamed down from 15,000 feet, accelerating past 400 miles per hour, their pilots holding steady through the buffeting turbulence of near-vertical dives. The first bomb hit Akagi at 10:26. It was a 500-pound bomb, and it struck aft of the midship elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar below. The explosion touched off the armed torpedoes sitting on their carts. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Fires spread instantly, fed by aviation gasoline, by armed bombs, by crates of machine gun ammunition. Within seconds, Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, the most famous carrier in the Japanese fleet, the ship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was a floating inferno. Kaga was hit even harder. 4 bombs struck the flight deck in rapid succession. Gasoline fires swept across the ship. The island's superstructure was engulfed. Sailors were blown overboard by explosions. The captain and most of the senior officers were killed in the first minutes. George Gay, floating in the water 4 miles away, watched it happen. He saw the dive bombers plunging out of the sky. He saw the explosions on the carrier decks, enormous fireballs that rose hundreds of feet into the air. He heard the deep thunder of secondary explosions traveling across the water. He watched black smoke columns climb toward the clouds, and he understood. His squadron's sacrifice had not been wasted. The Zeros that had killed 29 men of Torpedo Squadron 8 had been drawn down by those deaths. They had been out of position when it mattered most. The dive bombers had arrived into a clear sky. Torpedo Squadron 8 had opened the door. At almost the same moment, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown, Bombing Squadron 3, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, attacked the third carrier, Soryu. Leslie had lost his bomb due to an electrical malfunction during the approach, but he let his squadron in anyway. His pilots put 3 bombs into Soryu's flight deck. The result was catastrophic. Soryu, packed with armed aircraft and aviation fuel, exploded along her entire length. The fires were so intense that ammunition began cooking off within minutes. The captain ordered abandon ship within 20 minutes of the first hit. In 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers at Midway had been transformed from the most powerful warships in the Pacific into flaming wrecks. George Gay watched from the water as the battle that had killed his friends was won. If you're watching this and want to see more stories like this, where we dive deep into the real human cost of warfare, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. These are the stories history books often overlook, but they deserve to be remembered. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had escaped, located several miles from the other 3 carriers. She had not been spotted by the American dive bombers during their attack. Now, as Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, Hiryu's captain, Yamaguchi Tamon, prepared a counterstrike. At 10:54, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet. They found Yorktown and put 3 bombs into her flight deck. The carrier was badly damaged, fires spreading, but her crew fought back. They brought the fires under control. They restored propulsion. Yorktown was recovering when a second wave arrived. At 2:45 in the afternoon, 10 Japanese torpedo bombers from Hiryu attacked Yorktown. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire that shot down 5 of the attackers, 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side. Yorktown lost all power. She began listing heavily to port. The order came to abandon ship, but Enterprise and Hornet were still operational. Their scouts found Hiryu in the late afternoon, spotted by Yorktown's displaced aircraft, now operating from Enterprise. At 5 o'clock, 24 dive bombers dove on the last Japanese carrier. 4 bombs hit Hiryu. The forward elevator was blown out of the ship and thrown against the island structure. Fires swept through the hangars. By evening, Hiryu was a burning hulk, her captain and crew fighting hopeless fires as the ship died beneath them. George Gay, still floating in the ocean, saw none of this directly. Hiryu was too far away. But he saw the smoke, and he saw the American dive bombers heading west for the second strike, and he understood that the Japanese fleet was being destroyed. As darkness fell on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were lost or sinking. Akagi would be scuttled by Japanese destroyers the next morning when fires made her unsavable. Kaga sank during the night, her hull torn open by exploding magazines. Soryu went down that evening, taking her captain with her. Hiryu burned through the night and was scuttled at dawn on June 5th. The Japanese had lost their carrier striking force. They had lost over 250 aircraft with their crews. They had lost some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Men who could not be replaced, whose skills had been honed over years of operations. The Battle of Midway was decided in those 6 minutes of dive bomber attacks. But it had been made possible by the men who died in the 30 minutes before. George Gay floated in the Pacific until late afternoon, hiding beneath his seat cushion whenever Japanese ships or aircraft came near. The water was cold, his wounds throbbed, dehydration was setting in. He had no food, no water, no radio. As darkness approached, he finally climbed into his life raft. The Japanese fleet had moved away, pursuing targets to the west, or retreating from the disaster that had overtaken them. Gay was alone on an empty ocean. That night, he drifted in the darkness, listening to distant thunder that might have been gunfire or explosions. He thought about Waldron. He thought about Huntington. He thought about the 28 other men who had been alive that morning and were now dead. Dawn came on June 5th. Gay watched American patrol planes, PBY Catalinas, crisscross the sky, searching for survivors and enemy ships. He waved at them frantically, but they did not see him. The yellow life raft should have been visible, but the ocean was vast, and a single raft was impossibly small. Hours passed. The sun climbed. Gay was growing weaker. His wounds needed attention. He had been in the water for more than 24 hours. In the early afternoon, roughly 30 hours after being shot down, a Navy PBY finally spotted his raft. The flying boat landed nearby, its hull slapping across the waves, and pulled alongside the raft. George Gay was pulled from the water. He was the only survivor of Torpedo Squadron Eight's attack. Of the 30 men who had launched from Hornet that morning, he was the only one returning. He was taken first to a destroyer, then transferred to a cruiser, and finally flown to Pearl Harbor for medical treatment. His wounds were not life-threatening, but he needed surgery to remove shrapnel and treat the bullet wound in his arm. The medical staff marveled that he had survived at all. The crash, the hours in the water, the blood loss, the exposure. While he recovered in the hospital, the Navy debriefed him extensively about what he had seen. Intelligence officers sat by his bed with maps and photographs, asking him to describe everything he remembered: the approach, the attack, the crash, and most importantly, his observations of the Japanese fleet and the dive bomber strikes. Gay's testimony was invaluable. He was the only eyewitness to the dive bomber attack who had been watching from outside an aircraft cockpit. The pilots who had flown those missions had been focused on their individual targets, their instruments, their dives. They had seen what was directly in front of them. Gay had seen the whole picture, the sequence of attacks, the spread of fires, the behavior of Japanese ships and aircraft in the aftermath. His account helped piece together the timeline of the battle. It confirmed details that pilots, intent on their own survival and their own attacks, had been unable to observe. It provided a unique perspective on one of the most important naval engagements in history. The Navy awarded George Gay the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. The citation praised his exceptional courage in pressing home his torpedo attack, despite overwhelming opposition from enemy fighters, his conduct after being shot down while surrounded by enemy forces, and his remarkable survival against extraordinary odds. He was promoted to lieutenant junior grade. He became, briefly, one of the most famous men in America, the sole survivor of the doomed Torpedo Squadron. News of his survival was released to the press as part of the Midway victory announcement, and his story captured the American imagination. Life magazine ran a story on him. Newspapers across the country printed his photograph. The sole survivor of the doomed Torpedo Squadron became a symbol of American courage and sacrifice. But Gay never let the attention change his understanding of what had happened. He gave the credit to the men who died, to Waldron or to E, who had predicted where the Japanese would be and led his squadron to find them, to Huntington and the other gunners who had fought back despite impossible odds, to every pilot who had held course on his torpedo run, knowing he was about to die. Gay told reporters, "This part of the story is the hardest to understand, the most difficult to process without simplifying it into something comfortable. Torpedo Squadron 8 did everything right. They found the enemy. They pressed home their attack. They held formation under fire that would have broken most men. They released their torpedoes at the correct ranges to the correct targets, and every single one of them died except for one man. And every single torpedo missed, by any conventional measure. The attack was a catastrophic failure. 30 men dead for 0 results. An entire squadron destroyed without inflicting a single casualty on the enemy. But that is not what happened. That calculus ignores what the attack actually accomplished. The Zeros that killed Torpedo Squadron 8 were at sea level, out of ammunition, out of position, when the dive bombers arrived. The sacrifices of Gay's squadron and of the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown created a 6-minute window in which the Japanese Combat Air Patrol could not intercept the dive bombers. McCluskey's Dauntlesses arrived into empty sky and destroyed 3 carriers in 6 minutes. The torpedo bombers did not hit anything, but they drew down the defense. They opened the door. They made victory possible, and the men who did this, Waldron and Huntington and the 28 others, knew they were probably going to die when they took off from Hornet that morning. They knew their aircraft were obsolete. They knew they had no fighter escort. They knew the Zeros were waiting. They attacked anyway. There is no satisfying way to describe what this means. Courage is too small a word. Duty is too abstract. Sacrifice implies a choice, and perhaps they had one. But the choice they made was to follow their orders, trust their training, and attack the most powerful naval force in the Pacific without any realistic hope of survival. 30 men made that choice on June 4th, 1942. 29 of them died. The one who lived spent the next 50 years trying to explain what he had witnessed and ensure the others were not forgotten. George Gay remained in the Navy after the war. He continued flying, continued serving, and continued carrying the weight of being the sole survivor. He returned to combat in the Pacific, flying newer aircraft, taking part in later operations. He did not die young like so many of his contemporaries. Instead, he lived long enough to watch the Battle of Midway become history. He watched scholars analyze the battle, dissect every decision, argue about what would have happened if events had unfolded differently. He watched movies dramatize the fight and sometimes get the details wrong, and he kept telling the story of Torpedo Squadron 8. In 1979, he wrote a book called, quote, 5. It was an attempt to preserve what he remembered, to honor the men who had died beside him. To explain what their sacrifice had meant, survivor's guilt is a clinical term for something that cannot be captured in clinical language. Why did George Gay live when Robert Huntington died in the seat behind him? Why was his aircraft the last one shot down instead of the first? Why did he survive an ocean crash that should have killed him? There are no answers to these questions. There is only the randomness of war, the arbitrary cruelty of metal and fire, the pure chance that separates the living from the dead. Gay struggled with these questions his entire life. He never stopped asking why he had survived. He never stopped honoring the men who had not. If you've stayed with me through this story, consider checking out some of our other deep dives into the untold human stories of World War II. Every subscriber helps us continue bringing these forgotten heroes back to life. George Gay died on October 21st, 1994, at the age of 77. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. He had spent more than 50 years as the living memory of Torpedo Squadron 8, giving interviews, attending commemorations, and ensuring that the names of his squadron mates were not forgotten. The Douglas TBD Devastator was withdrawn from frontline service immediately after Midway. Everyone knew now what everyone had suspected. It was a death trap, hopelessly outclassed by modern fighters. Within months, Devastators were gone from the fleet, replaced by TBF Avengers that might have saved Torpedo Squadron 8 if they had been available a few months earlier. But the lessons of the battle extended far beyond aircraft design. Midway proved absolutely and finally that carrier warfare was decisive. Battleships, the pride of every navy, the monsters that consumed national treasuries, were obsolete. The war would be won or lost by pilots flying from floating airfields hundreds of miles from shore. The nation that could build carriers faster, train pilots better, and coordinate strikes more effectively would control the Pacific. The United States could do all of those things. Japan could not. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had more fleet carriers under construction than Japan had aircraft to put on them. The Essex-class carriers were the finest warships ever built. American pilot training programs produced aviators by the thousands. Japanese naval aviation bled white at Midway and in the grinding attrition battles that followed, could never recover the experienced crews it had lost. The war that followed Midway was not a fair fight. It was an industrial and logistical steamroller, grinding Japan backward across the Pacific, island by island, battle by battle, until the atomic bombs made further resistance impossible. All of that began on June 4, 1942, when 30 men flew obsolete aircraft into certain death and opened the door for the dive bombers that changed history. There is a memorial to Torpedo Squadron 8 at the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola, Florida. It includes a restored TBD Devastator, one of the few surviving examples of the aircraft, displayed alongside photographs and artifacts from the squadron. The names of all 30 men are recorded there. If you visit, you can read Waldron's final message to his men. You can see photographs of young faces that would never grow old. You can stand in front of the aircraft they flew and try to imagine what it felt like to launch from that deck, knowing you probably would not return. But you cannot really understand it. That is the truth about war that no memorial can capture. The experience of flying toward your death, of watching your friends burn and fall, of fighting with a single machine gun against fighters that could destroy you with a burst. These things cannot be transmitted across decades. They can only be acknowledged. George Gay tried to transmit them. For 50 years he told his story to anyone who would listen. In classrooms, in lecture halls, at reunions and commemorations. He wrote his book. He answered the same questions over and over from people who wanted to understand what it had been like. And he understood that words would always fall short. The morning of June 4, 1942, Ensign George Gay floated alone in the Pacific Ocean, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, hiding beneath a black rubber seat cushion, while Japanese fighters patrolled overhead. He was 25 years old. 29 of his squadron mates were dead. His rear gunner's body was sinking somewhere beneath him. His aircraft was scattered wreckage across miles of ocean. He had done everything asked of him. He had followed his squadron commander into an impossible attack. He had held his torpedo run despite fire that shredded his aircraft. He had survived through luck or providence or random chance when everyone else had died. And then he watched the dive bombers arrive. He watched the Japanese carriers burn, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, transforming in minutes from the most powerful warships in the Pacific into funeral pyres. He watched the tide of the Pacific War turn in 6 minutes of explosions and fire. He understood, floating in that water, what his squadron's sacrifice had purchased. He understood that their deaths had not been meaningless, that the zeros which had killed them were out of position at exactly the moment that mattered most. But understanding did not bring anyone back. George Gay spent the rest of his life carrying that understanding. He carried the knowledge that he had survived because others had died, that victory had been built on the bodies of his friends, that the greatest naval battle of the 20th century had begun with a slaughter that made the victory possible. He never let himself forget. And he never let America forget. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 flew their obsolete aircraft into the teeth of the most powerful fleet Japan had ever assembled. They had no fighter escort. They had no realistic chance of survival. Their torpedoes were unreliable. Their aircraft were slow, and the enemy fighters that swarmed them were the deadliest in the Pacific. They attacked anyway. 29 of them died in the water below the Japanese carriers. Their torpedoes missed. Their aircraft burned and fell. Their bodies drifted until the sea claimed them. But in dying, they cleared the sky. They pulled the zeros down to sea level, out of position, out of ammunition, unable to climb fast enough to intercept the dive bombers that arrived minutes later. They gave McCluskey and his pilots a clean path to the flight decks of 3 Japanese carriers. 6 minutes later, the war changed. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning hulks. Japan's offensive reach in the Pacific was broken forever. The tide of conquest that had seemed unstoppable since Pearl Harbor had reached its high water mark and begun to recede. 30 men made that possible. George Gay was the only one who lived to see it. He spent the next 50 years making sure the world understood what had happened, what their sacrifice meant, what their deaths purchased, what courage looks like when it knows it is going to fail and attacks anyway. Torpedo Squadron 8 did not win the Battle of Midway, but they made victory possible. And one man, bleeding and exhausted, hiding beneath a seat cushion in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, watched that victory unfold with his own eyes. He never forgot. Neither should we.